Here's what we're going to do. Today will be at some point probably a little complicated by this one fact. We're going to talk about the podcast today. Hopefully you've had time to check out the half-hour slice I assigned. Some of you, at least in semesters previous, have listened to the entire thing. That's cool. You're allowed to do that, but I want to remind you, you are not required to do that. That episode is like 3 hours long or something. You don't have to do that, okay? Anyway, and I also want to say you can watch it. I don't know if anybody took me up on that. It does offer you more material, potentially, if you think you're going to write about that one, to actually watch them on screen doing the things that they do. Anyway, what might complicate all of our efforts today is this. I always think about doing it, and I never do, but I always think about queuing up the podcast for class, and I guess we could listen to it for a minute. But it's a podcast, do you know what I mean? It's literally just two dudes in a room talking. So one, I don't know how beneficial it would be for us to just sit here and listen to it. It's not like listening to a song, you know? And for two, it's kind of hard to just find spots because it's just two dudes talking. So what I like to do instead is start out kind of broadly. Let's think about this. To remind you about what we talked about last time, we started with Birdemic, which I personally think is a lot of fun because that trailer's bananas. But then we moved in the second half of class to talk a little bit about John Oliver and all that. And we didn't get to have the full conversation about Oliver that I want to have, but we're going to dive more into that next time. I say all that to say this. If you recall, when we were talking about the Birdemic trailer, hi there, not the movie, the trailer, we had a conversation about standards, expectations. What's a trailer's goal? What's it trying to do? That's a question, by the way. What's a movie trailer trying to do?
Trying to get you to watch the movie.
Good. And we had a discussion about how Birdemic maybe doesn't quite do that. Before we move to what I want to talk about today, I have a quick note. I kind of think in a weird way it could. I just want to point that out to you because it is terrible. For instance, my wife and I sat down and watched that movie, half of it, because the trailer was so bad. Right? It could be so bad you're curious now. It was one of those. Anyway, the conversation I want to have now about the Rogan podcast, and we're going to talk about it in specific terms here in a bit. First, if we can, broad conversation. How do you know if a podcast is good? Another way to think about it, again, along similar lines to how we talked about the texts last time. What is a podcast trying to do? You know? With Oliver, we pointed out, he's trying to inform while entertaining you. Yeah? Pretty serious topic. He's going through all these points he's making, but he sprinkles jokes throughout. And this podcast is not like that. Pretty different, I would wager, right? But it's got to have some kind of goal, even if it's sort of unconscious or underneath the surface in some way, do you know? What are these podcasts trying to do you think? Just two dudes talking for 2 or 3 hours, you know? What are they trying to do? They're offering their perspective. My question would be, and this is an honest question, that could be wrapped up in their goal in some way. I'm not sure if it's their goal. What I mean is, to me, that's more of a symptom of what they're trying to do. Sharing their perspectives is the main part of how they achieve whatever their goal is, I think. That's a different way of saying sharing their perspectives. That's okay. What's a podcast trying to do?
Get people to watch.
Or listen. Yeah, cool. How does it do that? I think this is its goal. I think the end goal is, I hope somebody checks it out, right? But right before that is the goal that gets them to that one, if that makes sense. Okay? Like, Mountain Dew commercials want you to buy Mountain Dew. That's pretty clear. But they have a goal before that. Like, they want you to associate Mountain Dew with skateboarding or whatever the fuck it is, right? Bungee jumping. And that somehow convinces you, oh, bungee jumpers drink the dew, so I must, right? So that's the goal, is what I'm saying. Here, they want people to listen. Yes. How do they do that? They get people interested, right? And there's all different kinds of podcasts, but the one we're talking about, and this is the most popular, I think, people talking. Just people talking. On its face, that shouldn't be terribly interesting, right? I'm sure you hear people talking all the time and you wish you didn't. Try to tune them out. Maybe you're doing it right now. How do they get people to bother sharing their time, right? Again, 3-hour episode. He puts these things out 4 or 5 times a week. People listen. How do you do that, do you think?
Social status?
I mean, that helps. Although, again, in this particular case, people know who Joe Rogan is because his podcast got huge, right? So it's the inverse, kind of. But you will have famous people sometimes, like, starting a podcast, and that's a thing for sure.
I think it depends. Sorry. I think it depends if you have like because I know some podcasts have like special guest stars and stuff. During the NBA Finals, I listened to a podcast of a Warriors player named Draymond Green.
Yeah.
And he had like a podcast, and he had like multiple people come on the podcast.
I'm sure he'd be wildly entertaining.
It was actually really entertaining.
Yeah. What's entertaining about it?
It keeps you intrigued, like, on what you're about to listen to. Like you want to know like what you're about to hear, because like in his podcast, for example, he breaks down like during when they played the Boston Celtics, how they could have broken down like not play by play, but like kind of
some like different defenses or something. Like,
yeah, basically I would say like more like quarter by quarter, but basically it was they had different parts of the podcast and like, hey, how could we do this better? How could we do that better? And it's like intriguing to hear like what they actually have in mind. Like it's intriguing to hear other people's like inputs, I guess.
Well, in that particular case too, you're talking about like he has real knowledge.
Yeah.
I listen to a couple podcasts like sometimes they're educational, other times it's just experts just talking. But it's a person, and we can broaden it a little bit maybe. Let's try this on. Is it something like it's a person who knows a good deal, potentially, about whatever subject they're covering, and you might learn something, or you might not know everything they know, or you might not see everything the way that they see it, and you're interested to hear that perspective. I think that's we can probably shorten it somehow, make it sound more like a goal. But that's mainly their goal, right? Is to get you intrigued, get you invested in whatever the perspective is. Cool. Okay. Well, that's the goal here then. Again, broadly. Not quite the Draymond Green podcast, but probably fairly similar, in some ways. How do they do that? Again, in his case, he knows all kinds of shit that we could never. I mean, he's been playing basketball probably 30 years of his life, right? Like, so he knows everything there is to know. In this case, we got a guy, Joe Rogan, we got a guy, David Pakman, at the table. We're talking about social media, right? I guess I'll ask a question that could blow up in my face. Did you guys find it intriguing at all? Some of you? Okay.
Find what intriguing?
I'm such a parent, I was like, is there a lid?
Is there a lid?
Those lids are invaluable. About the podcast. Did you find it intriguing? These guys talking. And if so, why do you think that is? You can get specific if you want, or you can we can speak broadly for a couple minutes. Yeah.
I generally just find Joe Rogan interesting and entertaining.
Why do you think that is? Again, it's hard. It can be hard. I'm not saying it's easy to put into words, but what about it do you think? And it could be multiple things. You can just give us
I
one.
feel like he ties you in with humor, but he also has expertise at the same time.
He knows some things. Yeah.
Yeah.
One, I would, and we got to try to, because we got to try to talk about this episode, right? Like, he definitely has opinions. He definitely has a perspective. But oftentimes, I think this episode included, he'll have somebody on who clearly knows more than he does,
Yeah.
right? And that's interesting. Like I don't want to give you guys too much in your read. I feel like I saw your hand. Did I see your hand? All right, I'm gonna come to you in just a second. But it's a little bit like he's learning too,
Yeah.
at least at times. You know, that's interesting. It's almost like somebody sitting over your shoulder in a class, right? And you're participating, and you have thoughts too, but they're with you in some way, as opposed to watching you. If that makes sense. Like that's an important difference, I think. What did you have?
No, I was just like looking at how like they both have different perspectives in a way.
For sure, Rogan and Pakman.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about that? We can start there. Again, I'm trying to, because we're not going to play like 10 minutes of the podcast, I don't think that would go well. You guys would check out. I'm trying to just get it up in the air, basically. So, what's different about their perspectives, if you could help us a little bit?
I mean, they offered like different views on
Yeah.
how certain things are.
Yeah.
And they would like say, well, what about this opposed to that?
Yeah. What do they do cause I keep saying they're talking, and they are doing that. I think we could describe it a little bit better. We could be more specific. What kind of conversation are they having? We have words for it, I think. Huh? To a degree, yeah. But it's not even the adjective anymore, it's the noun. Go with me here in the weeds for just a second. So instead of conversation, how else might we define it?
I think sometimes on podcasts it can be very
Yeah.
controversial.
Oh, I mean, yeah, again, you guys worried about the adjective. We'll worry about that in a minute.
Argument?
Maybe. Now, here's what I'm concerned with. I do think, classically speaking, they're having an argument, right? My concern there, here in the past, I don't know, 20 years, give or take, that term has taken on like a bit of a connotation. Like when you guys think of argument, usually I think you think of like cable news or something, right? Just people shouting at each other. Yeah, and that is argument. That's a kind of argument. But classically speaking, it's not even like what argument should be. You're supposed to be much more objective and much more kind of robotic almost. The other word I would use is like a debate. I think I'm having a debate, right? And whether it's intellectual or controversial, whatever adjective you want to apply to it, I think that's how we have to think of this podcast. It's two dudes debating one another. And of course that means they have different perspectives, different opinions, different ideas. But I think that's part of what's interesting about it too. How would you describe how they debate each other? Now we can deal in adjectives.
Formal?
You feel like it's formal? What leads you to say that? I was curious.
I guess like based off of there's been certain situations where I've seen arguments from two different perspectives where it's
Yeah.
a bit more of like spewing things and not
More vitriolic. Do you guys know what that word means? Really hot anger. You feel vitriol. Like if I see somebody push my kid on the playground, everything in me not to end up on the news. You know what I'm saying? Like you feel it. Like anyway. Yeah. Well, so I don't know if formal. I mean, more formal than what you're talking about, right? But also not formal, huh?
I guess just like respect.
I think respectful is a better word. Okay. Because again, think of formality. You think of like how I'm not dressed, basically. Look, you can see my fucking calves. Like it's. You think about how Joe Rogan is dressed, how he even carries himself. He uses bad words. That's terribly informal. Pakman, conversely, more formal than Rogan. He's got a button up, But even he's not. I don't know. Well, again, he's more formal, but I don't know if you would qualify as formal either. How would you describe Pakman? And if you want to compare him to Rogan, it's fine. It can be. I'm trying to start you guys building an inventory. I should probably just trick you and not mention this, but I'm trying to be transparent. We're beginning to think about body paragraphs at this stage, okay? One of the things you can do, if you watched it, how many people watched it? I should have asked this already. 2, 3? Oh, you should have watched it. Okay, well, those 3, how are these guys dressed? How's Rogan dressed? What's he wearing? T-shirt. It's got some kind of graphic on it, I think, right? I think he's got a baseball cap, right? With a frayed bill. The shirt's very tight on him because he's in really good shape, so good for him. Pakman's wearing a button-up, no tie. So he's more formal than Joe Rogan, but I wouldn't put him at completely formal, right? Huh? For sure. The term I would use is like business casual, if you guys are familiar with this term. Okay. What does it do? I'm asking now, that this doesn't necessarily have to go anywhere, but I'm curious. Does it do anything to their debate to have them look different? And again, if you didn't watch it, the other way I would pose that question is, do they, in your mind, maybe just listening to it, do they come across differently at all, these 2 people? I couldn't tell if that was a yes or no. Was it a yes? Well, what about it? Talk to me about it.
I mean, you can tell that he's not the guest, that he's comfortable
Who?
in his dress. Rogan,
Okay. Yeah.
as opposed to his guest like coming in like business casual.
So what you're saying, if I follow you, here, we can even, let's take some notes on the board. Let's get crazy. You're saying Rogan's mode of dress is what we're talking about right now. And or, again, if you didn't listen to it, part of the point I was trying to make is I think their mode of dress kind of matches their demeanor or their approach, right? But Rogan, much more casual, obviously informal. Okay. You're saying, because I don't want to get this wrong, that he feels more at ease, first of all, which is true. Like, that's just how that reads, okay? But as a result of that, if you could continue now, I'm sorry. What else were you saying about him?
As opposed to
Uh-huh.
he's more casual, like business casual.
Yeah, well, I mean, so comparative, we won't say formal, but, more formal. You could also say more professional. Would that be fair? Again, if you only listen to it, I would contend that he sounds more professional than Joe Rogan, right? If only comparatively. Okay. If we're reading Rogan's dress, and again, I think he kind of carries himself that way, so he's more at ease. I don't think, for instance, Pakman seems anxious. I'm not reading that into his demeanor at all. He seems pretty comfortable. But does it change anything about how we read this guy? His different approach, his different mode of dress, his different mode of speaking. Because at the very least, he's not as at ease as this guy, right? I think that kind of, okay. You mentioned that he's obviously the guest, I think. What about that? What does it even mean to say someone is obviously the guest? As opposed to obviously not the guest, right? If you're obviously not the guest, then what are you? You're the host. What are some things we know about a host? We take these for granted. If you're the host, what else do we know about you?
Make the main one talking.
It's your show. It's your spot, right? What is that?
You can do what you want. While the other one can
Pretty
do what
much.
you
In a way that, Pakman couldn't, right? And again, not to say that he literally couldn't. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
He could be a bit more polite, or while Rogan, like you were saying, he can cuss all the time, but
Yeah.
he kind of refrained from it.
So all of this is to say, he has ownership of the space. And of course it helps that his name is on the damn thing, right? But the point we're making is this, even subconsciously, okay, can be in the audience's mind. This is this guy's space. As opposed to Pakman, who, again, we're not saying he's not at ease, we're just saying perhaps he's less so. He's a guest. And again, we know that. We're not groundbreaking here. But think about that term. Again, you're a guest at somebody's house, especially when you were younger. Maybe your first sleepover, and your mom's like, listen to me. You're a guest at their house. Like, that means something. You can't. When you're on your best behavior, I love having this conversation. What does that really mean?
Doing what the other person wants.
Well, I mean, when pushed to its nth, perhaps, you get kind of bossed around. And again, we're not saying that happens here necessarily, but what can't you do if you're on your best behavior?
Mess up.
Ideally. What'd you say?
Act out.
Yes. What can't you be? Is it
Rude.
A mess.
Yes. Hold on. Yes. Slow down for just a second. You guys went to not answering anything to like every, so slow down. If we have a phrase, an idea, like be on your best behavior, that would imply that most of the time you are not on your best behavior. Is that fair? I'm not saying you're a criminal, but most of the time, if there is a best behavior, then that is not what you do most of the time.
Neutral.
Sure. We all try to do okay. My question is, if you're on your best behavior, what are you not?
On your regular behavior.
Which is to say, you're not yourself. Right?
What if you're always on your best behavior?
I would be curious about that.
I'm on my normal behavior.
I'll be wondering if you're honest
Yourself.
there. But maybe. So all I'm saying is, in a long roundabout way, the implications to this term, this idea, kind of, if only a little bit, undercuts Pakman's what? If only like for 5%, we're questioning something about this guy. If we're saying, it seems like he might be trying to be a little too polite, right? Like a little
I'll be
too...
back.
Yeah.
He's not in his normal behavior.
So he's not...
Can't be himself all the way.
He's not completely... What? We have a word for this. If he's not completely himself. It's an
Honest.
Yeah. I was going for authentic, but honest works. And I want to be very clear. At no point am I saying, this guy's a fucking liar. I'm not saying that. But his mode of dress, his demeanor, especially, you can't really separate it from the fact that he's 5 feet from this guy, okay? All these connotations are going to get weighed against each other. And if you come out looking and sounding like the guest, at the very least, we're wondering about his honesty, his authenticity, right? And that's fair. All we've said is, as a viewer or listener, you hear him, one of them sounds more honest or authentic than the other. I would argue, right? That's the beginning of a critique. Curious about that. I understand, for instance, traditionally, if you say someone is dishonest or less honest, that seems like a negative. But what we have to do in the context of this paper is think about what the apparent aims are, what the goals are. Does anybody remember what we said the goals of this podcast were? We really only had one, but what was the goal of this podcast? Oh Lord. What's the podcast trying to do? Good. We didn't quite solve all the way, I think, how they do that, but we're gonna go at it backwards right now. So we're trying to get you to listen. And I'm honestly asking, does this question of honesty, authenticity, however you want to phrase it, does that factor in, do you think, to whether or not you want to keep listening to a podcast?
Yes.
Why aren't you sure? I'm just curious.
I don't know, because I feel like sometimes it wouldn't really matter.
Well, I mean, there are some. So, like, there's a podcast I used to listen to that is legit fake. Like, it's the protagonist pretends like he fell through a portal into a medieval realm, right? And he's somehow doing a podcast from there, and it's bananas. That's supposed to be fake. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. So, but in this context, these are two dudes who are supposed to be themselves, right? At least to some extent. And in that case, like the Draymond Green case, or whatever podcast you're checking out, if it's a person who's supposed to be themselves, I'm just curious if this conversation about authenticity in your mind matters. Does it affect whether or not you think you keep listening? The flip side of that would be, if someone seems inauthentic, do you think you would stop listening? Or again, does it not really matter?
We just want to like listen for a bit, but if they keep, there's like a demeanor
Uh-huh.
that makes me feel like they're dishonest, or
Yeah.
it's just I'm not gonna be as intrigued by it.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's not appealing to me.
Why do you think that is?
They lack the credibility.
That's interesting. That's an interesting way to think about credibility, because what we're saying here, traditionally, I stood up too fast. This happens to you when you get old. It's also the only way you can get high when you're 40, is you just stand up too fast. I don't know if that's the thing you guys do, but if you go from the floor to up here, everything gets weird.
Maybe your iron's low.
Probably. I probably get all kinds of stuff, but mostly it didn't happen when I was your age. It only happens now. So, age is involved. The point, when we talked about the social dilemma, we talked about credibility, right? There's all those experts and their resumes. They're deeply impressive resumes for most of those people, right? That's easy to understand. Here, we're not really talking, I mean, Joe Rogan is on social media a lot, so I guess he's kind of an expert in a way, right? But he didn't make Instagram, like he's not one of those people. So now we're talking about credibility in a very different way. And I think you're right. I think it's attached to this. Yeah? To sum all that up, okay? What we're not saying is either one of these guys is consciously lying or even consciously telling the truth, okay? What we're saying is they believe what they're saying. Does that make sense? Like, you could accidentally tell a lie, but if you don't know that, you're not lying in the paradigm we've built. You follow? Great. So authenticity equals credibility? Sometimes. What do you guys think? I'm mostly having a conversation with Eureka, which is fun, but I'm just curious. I mean, a couple of you have chimed in. But does authenticity matter when it comes to thinking about somebody's credibility, in your opinion? Like, again, if somebody seems inauthentic, we have a better word for that. It's more pejorative. Rhymes with rake. Good. If you say someone is fake, why is that an insult? Tom Cruise has built an entire career, decades, of being fake. Although he does some of that shit for real too, which is a whole other conversation. Because he's an actor, right? We like fake stuff. Those Avengers movies are rad. And they're very fake. Well, go ahead.
I feel like people don't like when you change yourself to make people like you. Like, I feel like that's
So again, to be clear, because one of the primary goals is to keep people invested, intrigue them, keep them listening. Another way to think about that, or maybe fold it into that, is to get them to like you, like your personality.
Yeah.
This is all personality in a podcast like this. And if at any point it seems like you're acting, why don't we like that? This is important. I agree with you, by the way.
It discredits it.
In what way, though? Like, what discredits what about you, I guess, is what I would ask.
Your opinion, when you're trying to argue,
Why? I'm just asking. Like,
it loses like potential to have more than
yeah, here's what we got to solve. Before we can necessarily wonder about arguments, okay? Here's what we got to solve. What is it? I think you're right. There's a connection between the kinds of people we think these people are and whether or not we listen or watch. Is your hand up? I can't tell.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, I guess in my mind, like, I don't want a friend that's not gonna have an opinion.
So they're friends.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah.
Oh, no, I mean,
Yeah, like, I don't wanna have somebody that I'm talking to and then just, you know, try and agree and have, like, no personality. Like, I want different opinions, you know?
so we feel like, and by the way, I'm acting like this is a discovery. There's theories about this called parasocial relationships, okay? But the idea you guys kind of worked your way into is like, it's not just that we feel invested or intrigued, but that's part of it. But you feel connected to these. Like, again, I don't know how many of you listen to podcasts. If you don't, you probably will someday. It's something you kind of age into. But if you start following a podcast, especially one like this, again, 3 hours for an episode, 4 or 5 episodes a week, that's a lot. I haven't talked to my parents that much in my life. You know what I'm saying? That's a lot of time. I think you do feel connected, right? And it's not unlike a friendship. But it's a friendship where you only hear the person, they don't ever hear you. That's the parasocial part, right? But again, if you found out one day your friend didn't have an accent or whatever, you're like, what the fuck? Like you'd feel betrayed? Is that too strong a word? Like, so now we're talking about trust too? Like all of this gets wrapped up not just in honesty, but in that conversation about credibility. We're emotionally invested in a weird way to these figures, and trust is involved in that. And if they ever don't seem honest, like to whoever it is we think they are, now all of a sudden,
Heck yeah.
all I keep thinking is they're right next to the bathroom, and I'm like, good for her. Anyway, cool. So if we were thinking about a body paragraph, and we're not quite yet, you don't have to stress too much, okay? I would say taking either one of these guys on, the way they're dressed if you like, or again, if you only listen to it, I think this still pretty much describes how he talks and how he talks. Their mode got us to thinking about this, which got us to credibility, which got us to how that conversation about credibility either negatively or positively impacts our connection to these personalities, right? Awesome. All right, now I want to hear from you guys. If we can, we'll see how this goes. What time is it, by the way? What's that? How was that? 107. Thank you. Anything, and you'll have to use your memory, and I apologize. Anything that stood out to any of you, could be something somebody said, because of course it is a podcast. If you watched it, it could be something that happened on screen or something you noticed. Anything at all. Just curious. You guys are fun. All right. All right. I brought a quotation because I thought this might happen. All right. At one point, At one point, Joe Rogan says this to Pakman. To provide slightly better context, they're talking about how social media companies work, whether or not they have political biases as a company, how that might manifest in certain mechanisms, like they touch on things like shadow banning. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, it's not super important necessarily. But they're kicking all these ideas around. And toward the end of that part of their discussion, and I believe it's toward the end of the section we watched, Rogan says this to Pakman. I appreciate what you're saying, and I agree with you to a certain extent. Now, of course, I think this is a pretty good quotation. I'm curious if anybody else does. And what I mean by that is, in the same way we worked with quotations from the Social Dilemma, at least to an extent, is there any language in here, and spoilers, there is, but do you see any language in here that might, the way I want you thinking about it is, does it do anything more than what it literally says? That's always your first concern.
To a certain extent.
What about that?
It shows how he does agree a little bit, but he's also disagreeing some.
So this is a rhetorical device that we have, right? Because he said, literally, he says, I agree with you. But then, comma, to a certain extent. Which, of course, says, there's a whole other extent that I don't agree with you. That's interesting. Oop, I've already screwed up. Disagreeing. Without saying so, right? Why would he do that? Again, he's the comfortable guy. This is his spot. Why couldn't he just say, nah? Why do it this way? And if you're not sure, again, another question you can ask yourself is, this is a thing people do. Why does anybody disagree without saying they disagree? Right? What's the function of that, rhetorically?
I feel like to keep the conversation going, because if you just go nah, people are just going to stop talking to you or stop listening.
Well, so two things there. Let's start with the conversation between them first. If he said no, you're saying it could kill the conversation. Why? Do you think?
It could kind of discredit him.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Because he's coming in and he's probably like, he's supposed to know what he's talking about, and him saying that I don't agree with you at all is like kind of a slap in his face. Like,
We got to be careful with he and his. So it's like Rogan is slapping Pakman in the face?
yeah.
Why do you feel that way?
By disagreeing? Because
Yeah.
He brought him on to talk about what they're talking about. So it's like,
Yeah. Well, I'm going to push back a little bit, but only because there's more of an answer to what you're saying, okay? He clearly doesn't agree with him, right? And he says so without saying it. But what I'm curious about, because I don't think you're wrong, to a certain extent, why would him saying, I don't agree with you, I disagree, why would that read like an insult, If only comparatively. That's kind of what you're saying, is it being insulting. I think that's a little bit what you're getting at as well. Huh?
Lessen tension.
This does? Why is it tense to disagree with somebody? Curious.
Because it could make your guess put walls, oh well, they're not willing to at least see it from my perspective.
Okay. So what you guys are getting at, I think, and again, please correct me if this is not accurate. You're saying something like, to outright disagree verbally, with that language, I do not agree, could register as an insult. Or at the very least, could register as, not trying to have a conversation or something? Is that fair? Okay. So, something about this, by the way, we're going to define it, and that'll be fun. You guys will enjoy that. But something about this. Allows further conversation for the reasons you guys enumerated. I'm not going to have room for all that on the board, okay? What is it? What is this speech? And I say we got to define it because that'll help us in the paper. Most of the time when you have too much language or you're not sure how to say a thing, it's because you're hung up on trying to name it, describe it, okay? So in this case, we have words for this. When you say it this way, I agree with you to a certain extent. What kind of speech is that? What's the tone of that kind of speech?
More passive.
You said, sorry, I just woos. You said massive?
More passive.
Oh, not. I was like, I didn't know what the hell you meant. Passive. What do you mean by that? You're saying not aggressive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to keep the aggressive heat down.
For sure. Okay, so this is true. And again, this is part of what we're talking about here. Did I just not put an R? It would seem to shut down conversation, generally speaking, if you got really aggressive at a certain point. I know I wouldn't want to talk to you. It's happened with students sometimes. That's always fun. But yeah, it definitely, the tension you guys are alluding to makes all of this more difficult, I suppose. So passivity is one way we could think about it. I think we mentioned respectful earlier as well, could be part of it. And again, maybe those are linked for us. Maybe a way to show respect in a conversation is to not be aggressive, right? Because the flip side of that coin would be to disrespect somebody in a conversation would be to be aggressive, right? That kind of makes sense to me, I think. Okay. So passivity, respectful, polite, just being polite. Yeah. Like these are all, any of those terms I think could be applicable, is the point I'm making in this case. I think that helps us describe the tone, right? And once we do that, that helps us get here. So this, and again, you can use any of the language we had, but I'll just roll what we got first. This sort of passive tone, this non-aggressive tone allows for further conversation. Because why? Because now I just want to make a complete sentence. How does this passive tone allow for further conversation between these two people? And of course, for further listening, which we'll talk about in a second, because that's their ultimate goal. Talk to me like I'm dumb. How does that get us to further conversation?
It doesn't, so like it opens it up to another path where they can.
Yeah.
Why? Why though?
Because they want to have interactions and see from each other's perspective.
Well, that's why they're doing it. Well, maybe the other perspective could be part of your answer. Like, how does being polite or respectful allow for further conversation? It might have something to do with the prospective business you ended up at. What do you guys think? I can tell you guys are having a lot of fun.
You can talk to someone politely, but once they start getting rude or aggressive, usually you either get really heated arguments or
Yeah.
you just quit talking to the person.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because it's a choice. Like,
To talk to somebody?
yeah.
Yeah. What do you say?
Like disrespect, so you don't want to hear the other person's argument.
Why is that?
What's the
They're not
point?
listening to yours.
Yeah.
Ah. Okay. Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. Huh?
An eye for an eye.
So as soon as somebody gets aggressive, we get aggressive back,
Usually.
is what you're saying.
You kind of got your.
Well, you either
two
get
sides.
aggressive or you just wash your
shut
hands
down.
of it.
Yeah, you just walk away.
Yeah. Okay.
Depends on the person.
Yeah. But okay. So because we gotta find a way to sum any and all of that up. I think the big takeaway is something about about this? We'll take a leap here. Is that too strong? It shows he can be convinced of his argument. Isn't that kind of a way of saying, like, because again, we've been very adamant that he does not agree, and that is what this means, literally, okay? But I kind of wonder if this phrase also implies, you know, you got me a little bit of the way. You could convince me for it. Isn't that an interesting way of saying, I am listening to you, right? To listen to someone honestly is to very much imply they could convince you of their perspective, right? Because if you can't be convinced, can you really say you're listening? I don't know, right? Cool. Okay. The other part I wanted to talk about, and it plays very well with what you guys have already said. That bit. I appreciate what you're saying. That's a weird thing to say. I just want to be real clear. Like, well, we should define our terms real quick. This does not mean what you guys are probably most used to hearing when you hear appreciate. He's not saying thank you for what you're saying. That's not what he's doing. Okay. There's an older way to use appreciate. Does anybody know what he's saying here?
Kind of like acknowledge, maybe.
Good. That's all he's doing. He's literally acknowledging what Pakman said. And again, to that, my most immediate response is, that's weird. Because they're right next to each other. And they have headphones on where they can hear what the other person is saying. Like, of course, he heard what he said. You see what I'm saying? So the fact that for some reason he feels compelled to say this is interesting to me. Right? Yeah.
I feel like that means that he really was like listening and like thinking about what he said. Like, you know what I'm saying?
I think
Sometimes we just say that like, I heard you, but like,
Yeah.
kind of tuned it out at the same time, but he genuinely was like considering like what Pakman said.
He's trying to impress upon him that he is listening in an active sense. Like, I think is what we were getting at, right? Not just hearing him, but listening, trying on his ideas, perhaps not agreeing completely,
Right.
but actually entertaining them. Is that fair? Okay. So now, we're going to write that down. I would even, again, to make it a little stronger, I'd say, like, he goes out of his way. Yes, ma'am. I didn't hear the last thing you said. What's up?
I was like, it could also have a different meaning because I've
Okay.
had instances where people be like, I appreciate what you're saying, kind of in a condescending
Ah.
tone.
Well, tone is important, and we talked about it a little bit here. It was passive. I don't know that we would qualify that as passive, but the fact that it's joined to this passive tone, polite, respectful tone here, does that shape at all how you hear this? How do we describe the tone here? It can be different. I'm just curious. I'm going to write what you guys think about it. I guess what we're asking, because that does exist, what you're talking about. I appreciate what you're saying, like, right? Some snark to it. I don't think that's how it is here. I don't. But I mean, again, I'd be willing to be convinced. But the way you seem to read it, I think, is it's genuine, right? That's kind of our two primary possibilities here. It could either be condescending as shit, which is possible, or genuine. And you would obviously read those very differently. If you read it as genuine, again, that's at least the more interesting to me because it's odder to me. Like, it's a weird thing to say and mean it, I guess. Condescending I'm more used to, because people are shitty all the time. So, either way, I'd be willing to try either one on. I'm inclined to lean toward genuine, but I feel you on people are dicks sometimes. You know. Okay. Supposing we at the very least go down this track, all right? All of this, it would only be a couple sentences in your paper. It wouldn't be that extensive. It looks like a lot because it's on the board, okay? But this is building, this is the first step in the process, rather. Let me back up. So I told you last time, we're still doing rhetorical analysis. That's this, okay? The second step in the process is critique. So what we do now is we take our rhetorical analysis, which may not be the best because I take notes like a crazy person, okay? We take this and we try to think about how any of it might affect, and I'm going to phrase this carefully, whether or not we think the text is successful, okay? I'm going to define that better. Here's what I mean by that. What we're not talking about is whether or not the Joe Rogan podcast is successful financially, because it is. Like, that's just established. He's doing quite well. Good for him. That's not what we're doing, okay? What we're trying to think about, all the way back to our earlier conversation, what is this podcast trying to do? What is its goal? It's trying to get us invested, involved. We got all the way to almost feel like you know these people, or, I mean, is it too strong to say like you're in the room almost, right? Like you're right there, kind of. If that's the goal, and there could be smaller goals, shooting off from that, but if that's the goal, our critique has got to be, well, if I'm saying this, does that positively, negatively, or somewhere in between affect their attempt to reach that goal? What do you guys think?
I think it's a positive way to reach that goal, because,
Why do you think so?
I mean, based off of, what we said, how it allows for further conversation, allows you to be, showing that you can be convinced. It just kind of keeps you listening rather than, being bored.
All right, so you cite that and this. What I want to know, what the hell has that got to do with the listening? I agree with you, by the way. But all the parts where you just said, you basically waved your hand and said, you get it. That's the stuff that's got to be in your paper, okay? And I know it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but that stuff that, unfortunately, I say you guys, I've been trained to do it, and maybe I've trained my way out of it, or maybe I've always been a psycho. But you've been trained to get to the hard part, like the real analysis, and go, you know what I mean. And everyone around you has been trained to go, yeah, we do. Let's talk about cheeseburgers or something, right? Like, you just move on, and you got to try to stay there, okay? So anytime, even in your own brain, you go, you know what I mean, me. You don't. You got to try to put words to it, okay? But I do think you're right, if we can put words to it. What about, we'll take the first one, allowing for further conversation. How might that positively, perhaps, impact making the listener feel more involved? Again, people watch cable news, not me, mostly old people, but like they seem to watch it all the time, and it's a lot of shouting. So it must be good for someone. Why does this work? We could negatively critique it, by the way. I think it'd be hard, but we could try. Why do listeners like that? Is all we're really saying.
Because they're from a different perspective, and will at least be willing to hear the opponent.
So what the point you're making, the point you're making is, because he allows for Pakman's different perspective, that heavily implies he would allow maybe for our different perspectives. And we kind of like that, which is to say we don't like the inverse. This guy's an asshole, who I can tell wouldn't listen to me at all. I think so. So what you're saying allows for further conversation from that guy, which invites differing perspectives from Pakman as well as the listener. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Again, all we've said is like the tone, the way he goes about disagreeing with this guy that he disagrees with, tells the listener, hey, if you're on Pakman's side here, it's all good, baby. Don't say it that way in your paper. But like that's what we're saying here in some ways. Cool. What about this one? It shows he can be convinced. On the one hand, I think it could tie into this as well, right? Because you're like, maybe I could convince him. You know, yeah, maybe. Does it allow for anything else? I'm honestly asking. It may not. I kind of think it does, but it may not. If he says he could be convinced, or he implies it at least, how might that positively or negatively impact what they're trying to do in this podcast, do you think, when it comes to the listener, to the audience? Also, do you guys hear like some static? Is that just me?
It's frustrating.
Cool. All right. Well, it's better that it's not just in my head, you know?
Yeah. I hear it like up here, like it's like that.
There's nothing. This isn't even on. There could just be that area. Anyway, I've done all I can. Maybe it's just there. Where were we? It shows he can be convinced. Does that do anything else for the listener? You think about, you know, again, we really haven't touched on this enough in our paragraph. Might this play into the conversation we were having about not being friends with these people, but feeling like you're damn near to being friends with these people, or that you could know them in some way, that they could be authentic, right? That whole conversation. If he says he can be convinced, like on its face, that might fly in the face of some of that. If he says he can be convinced, well, it's like, man, do you have an opinion or don't you? Right? Like sort of thing. Is it a part of that conversation at all about authenticity or believability? You know? I'll put it to you this way. If he was running for president, somebody would point to that and go, he's flip-flopping. He's a flip-flopper. Type of deal. You guys just don't want to come out and play today. Okay.
Are you asking like,
I'm asking like 7 questions.
as opposed to like him just being on a Western podcast to him being the president, how would it impact?
No, I was throwing out examples for you guys to take the bait on one of them. Yeah. Here, let's take it all the way back to square one real quick. When he says, or rather he implies, because he doesn't state it literally, that he can be convinced. You might convince me, you know, we kind of said he's implying here. Okay. Again, we have words for that. If a person says they could be swayed, right? They could be convinced of your argument, your perspective. What's some of the language we have for that kind of a person?
Open-minded.
Yeah, that's the positive one, right? One of the negatives would be flip-flopper. But the positive ways is open-minded. I feel this way because we're human beings and you feel ways. That's kind of how it goes. But the more positive spin would be, well, I'm also an open-minded person, so if you give me a good argument, you might give me, man. I might change my mind today, type of thing. Might the fact that we're saying he seems open-minded here, or at least he indicates that he is, might that impact the listening experience at all?
Yeah.
I think so.
Because I think like if you're open-minded
Yeah.
and can be convinced, I think it would like, so the other person that's arguing, I think it would help. If, say he was open-minded and he agreed with the other person at the end,
Mm-hmm.
like I think that would have a big impact on you.
Yeah, why?
Because if you went from being the one with the argument of, hey, that's not gonna work,
You saying as a listener?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like if if you also agreed with the person, like, hey, that's not gonna work, but he was open-minded, and then in the end came to the conclusion like, hey, it could, I think that would affect you as a listener as well by saying, like you might think, yeah, it could work.
Oh, so it might sway you just from him being open and maybe you not initially.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I don't know that we have to actually go that far, but I mean, that's interesting.
I also feel like a podcast, like something like that would be more interesting, like if, somebody could be convinced, because if they're just closed-minded, then it goes
Yeah.
absolutely nowhere, like there's kind of no point in listening to it.
Well, again, I keep using this example, but then I think you end up more like cable news, right? Like, I don't know how much cable news you watch. I try to not, okay? But it's like always on in the waiting room in hospitals and stuff. Like, I don't know why. You never get the opinion that any of these people at the end of their little 2-minute rants are ever gonna go, I see your point, Kevin. Like, they're never gonna do that, right? They're just gonna keep shouting until we go to commercial. So it's almost like, I mean, I'm going out on a limb here, but some of you are packing up, so I feel like we're running low on time. What time is it, by the way?
35.
Okay. But I almost feel like if no one is ever going to change their mind, then why are we fucking talking at all? Right?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of, at least I think that's the point of conversation, traditionally, to hear each other and share ideas. And if you do that honestly, then you would hope you could be convinced, right? Like it's an option. And if it's not, then it's not a conversation. You're just talking at each other, I think. And so we like it when it's a real conversation. And there's different ways to talk about that, to be clear, okay? One of them is much more like that. It's along those same lines. Invites differing perspectives, yes, for sure. Another way to think about it, if it's a real conversation, I think we're kind of back to talking about authenticity. It's an authentic conversation, you see what I mean? Not just because both of these people seem honest with what their perspectives are. I mean, it's part of it. But also because something about, and I'd love if any of you could help us solve this real quick. Something about podcasts, the ones that we like anyway, seem to involve real conversations. Not just that they're not scripted, but that it's real people talking like real people. Does that make sense? A little bit? I don't know why that is. I think some of it is relating to them, like we were talking about earlier. I think it's a big chunk of it. I just don't know if that's all of it. The idea that we like it when real people have actual conversations, as opposed to no possibility for exchange, like no possibility for, I appreciate what you're saying, I agree to you to a certain extent. Like that's never gonna happen in those other spots, I don't think. What do you guys think? Most of you look tired. Some of you look bewildered, which is not what I'm shooting for at the end of a class usually.
I'm just exhausted.
All right. Well,
Long morning.
They're involved in it.
do I know?
I think people like to feel like they're involved in it, like from hearing to
Yeah.
counter arguments.
If we can try, and we may not be able to, but we're going to try, with the last couple minutes of class, what is it about a real conversation that makes us feel more involved, do you think? That's kind of the limb I've pushed us out on.
Because it's not a bunch of people writing what needs to be said, but just like proposal communication, like over there, that's happening.
Yeah. Like it's more organic, it's more natural. And that to us, again, is at least I would think we live our lives like with normal conversation, with like maybe trying to hear each other, or at least hopefully. Huh?
It's like a live.
Yeah. It's like a conversation you would have, where you have an idea. Again, we all have biases, we all have ideas. But if you actually talk to somebody, you might change it. Or you might have your same idea at the end, but at least you would hear what the person said. Right? Yeah. And I feel like, and we'll end on this, I almost wonder, that's becoming rarer. I mean, at least on like TV and stuff. But you don't see it as much, you know? Anyway, cool. All right. So what we did today, we threw out, we had a quotation, and that was like hardcore, one piece of evidence, you know? We raised a couple at the top of class with like modes of dress, and again, if you didn't watch it, I think you can still just characterize how these people carry themselves, like demeanor or tone or perspective, you know? I would recommend, I want to say it one more time, if you think you're going to end up writing about this, I would go watch it. Because it just gives you more to talk about. I think that would help you. Anyway, for homework, this is what I was driving at. It's 3 signs and elements, okay? And people always freak out about this because it's weird words. All I mean when I say sign or element is evidence. That's all I mean. 3 pieces of evidence from one text, okay? It might be kind of early in the process for some of you to pick one, but I think it's good for you to go ahead and pick one. Can you change your mind later? Sure. I would still pick one. Either Rogan or Oliver, and we'll try to focus on Oliver next time. I like to kind of switch them back and forth. Just pick 3 specific pieces of evidence. It could be a quotation, it could be something you see on screen, it could be the way a person is dressed. That part's up to you, okay? But make it specific and to the best of your ability. Just briefly. You don't have to go crazy. Try to give me a little bit of rhetorical analysis. And if you can, try to give me a little bit of critique. Just a little, right? This is early paper stuff. What's up?
You want us to watch one of the podcasts?
From the podcast that we were listening
I'm confused because I saw multiple episodes.
On course then?
Oh, on course? Never mind.
Here's what all right. I'm gonna make it clear. I want you to pick one of the texts, either the John Oliver video or the Joe Rogan episode. Okay. The thing about the Joe Rogan episode, if you're gonna write about it, I would recommend you watch it as opposed to just listen. Is what I'm saying. And again, to be clear, it doesn't have to be the whole episode because it's long. But I would watch that section.
I don't know it was on course.
All right, it's all good.